Hi, everyone. I want to introduce to all of you our guest. I'm thrilled to have Sean with us. So I'm going to read Sean's bio. Dr. Sean Esbjörn-Hargens is a global leader in the application of integrative thinking to leader development and organizational design. He's the founder of the Exo Studies Institute, and we're going to define that in case some of you are wondering, what does that term mean, Exo Studies? He's the founder of the Exo Studies Institute. Sean combines a strong academic background in the philosophy of science and integrative metatheories with an open-hearted exploration of the mystery and multi-layered nature of reality. Now that rings bells for me. The mystery and multi-layered nature of reality. Among his multiple books, Sean co-edited Dancing with Sophia, Integral Philosophy on the Verge. So welcome, Sean. Thank you for taking your time to be with us. Sean, I'm glad you're here. How are you?
Good, really good. It's great to see you, Linda. Hello, everyone. I'm totally excited to be with you all tonight. I love Linda and her work. She's been a huge support for me in my own journey of kind of making sense of my interplanetary soul process and unfolding. So I'm just delighted to connect and share and support all of you in your own process of trying to make sense of this crazy world we find ourselves in.
That's just so totally true. So I have a zillion questions here. We'll just kind of let it morph into where it goes. So Sean, I'm going to start from scratch. Where were you born and where did you grow up, Sean?
I was born in Shelton, Washington, which is on the Puget Sound. And I grew up in that area until first grade. And then I moved south to Coos Bay, Oregon, where my dad had grown up. And then I grew up there through high school. I went to Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. And then I went to Peace Corps and I lived in Chad, Africa for 3 years. And then I moved to San Francisco to go to grad school at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And I've been in the Bay Area ever since.
Okay, so this is what happens for me, everybody, and I think you might find this fun. This is kind of how, I mean, obviously I know Sean, but Sean's, if I was just learning about Sean. Okay, so first of all, I'll just say one quick thing, and that is that these are always those crazy synchronicities. So Sean knows my husband, Earl. Earl's father was born in Coos Bay. So I know where Coos Bay is. Earl's an Oregonian. He's an Oregon native. So you're going to learn, everybody, more about Sean as an IP. What are some of the things that already begin to stand out? Now, it isn't that all IPs go into the Peace Corps, but I would hazard to say that for people that go into the Peace Corps, they are not young souls. Young souls wouldn't be telling me, these are my hunches, that they went into the Peace Corps.
Linda,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm having a ton of goosebumps occurring in my whole body as you just started the piece about Peace Corps.
Oh, wow. Okay. Do you have any idea, Sean, what those goosebumps are about?
No, whenever I get them, they seem to be basically like a truth indicator of some sort. Like they're somehow an energetic response to something that's truthful.
Yeah. That makes total sense to me. So the other quick things I'll just say, I don't want to, there's so much for Sean to talk about today, but because I'm not an Oregon native, but I lived in Oregon in the early years of my dating and married Earl, I know the respectability of Lewis and Clark College as one of the more respectable small arts and science schools in the country. And then Sean tells us that he went to the California, what's called CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, a very progressive graduate program of learning. Okay, all right. So Sean, at what age did you begin to either have inklings or know or suspect you were different than other people, or even began to have some inklings about being in what, the term I use is interplanetary soul?
Yeah, I think that really came into my awareness about 10 years ago. So when I was in my 30s, early 30s. However, going way back when I was young, there were things now that I look back and think, oh, maybe that was a moment or, an indicator. And there was things like, I often felt like all the way up through college, sometimes when I would look at someone just passing, sometimes a friend, sometimes a stranger, I often would have like this really deep empathic experience of feeling like I understood in a non-conceptual way, like some deep aspect of who they were, but it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But it was like I would get these hits on people. I've always loved nature. I've been deeply, deeply connected to the natural world. And I think, and as you know, part of my story, and I'll share here, I think my entry point was when my first daughter was born. I was no longer really able to practice Tibetan Buddhism and the diamond approach tradition, which had been my major spiritual paths up to that point. And both my wife and I were long-term practitioners in those paths. And those paths were like really good on your integral resume, right? Because I worked a lot with Ken Wilber and was part of the integral group. And so Tibetan Buddhism and Diamond Heart were like, yeah, good job. But then when my daughter was born, I had no time to formally practice. And what emerged in that kind of spiritual crisis, if you will, was I was drawn to the fairy faith. I was drawn to working with elementals and nature spirits. And this had been a long time interest. I'd always read a lot about clairvoyants who could access that world. But all of a sudden I decided to like experientially go there and see what would happen. And that really was kind of the turning point that then through a series of things led me to realize that I have a galactic kind of commitment.
And this is fascinating, and I knew it would be fascinating because I'm an earth-based soul. But earth-based souls tend to get or resonate with other experienced souls. It doesn't matter whether they're interplanetary or their angelic realm. And so, this is kind of what I'm hearing, as Sean talks. Yeah, I hesitated to ask this question, Sean, but because I was thinking today, I made this whole crazy long list of questions for you. And I know that you spent a number of years working with Ken Wilber. And for people who don't know Ken Wilber's work, it's, and probably, Sean, you could explain it far better than I, but it's very humanistic. It's very, I might call it phenomenological. Was there anything, Sean, about working initially or spending time around coordinating, collaborating with Ken Wilber that gave you clues that you were interplanetary?
Ken, I've had a number of experiences of soul contracts over the years. I've had at least 3 moments of clarity, what I call moments of clarity. One was when I finished Peace Corps and I was traveling in India, and apparently had a strong Jupiter transit in my natal chart, which seemed to line up for that being a good time to go to India exploring spirituality. And I bumped into a fellow traveler, a woman, and I had a moment of clarity. I won't go into the story, but it's a very fascinating one, and several synchronicities. And it was basically a precognitive moment of realizing we were going to travel together for a certain amount of time. My feeling was that I had contracted with her to support her in awakening to trauma. So that was one. The second was when a friend sent me in Peace Corps. Actually, this one occurred before that one. In Peace Corps, I got a book in the mail. It takes about 6 months for a book to get to you when I was there. So it was like a prized possession. And it was a book of Ken Wilber. I'd read one of his before. I liked it. They knew this. They sent me another one. And I read it basically nonstop. And I had what I call an intellectual satori. where all of a sudden, all the information I had read let me back up just a little bit. In college, at Lewis and Clark College, every semester, I had to get permission from the dean to take extra courses because I was always registering for more courses than my colleagues who were taking 3 courses. I always took 5, which was basically considered a double load. And every semester or quarter, I had to go in and make my case and get permission. When I graduated in 4 years, I had enough credits that were equivalent to 6 years of courses. So I crammed 6 years of courses into 4 years. So I've been hungry for knowledge. I just interdisciplinary, integrative, holistic, just philosophy, religion, everything, psychology, literature, ecology, just like can't get enough. When I read Wilber's book, The Brief History of Everything, he brought it all together in his maps where my head just went, poof. And in that moment, it wasn't a spiritual awakening as much as it was what I would consider an intellectual awakening, which is related to me on my spiritual path, where I realized in that moment, it was another moment of clarity, that I would spend the rest of my life engaging with this integral map that Ken Wilber had put together. And then sure enough, within a few years, I was back in the West Coast. I got involved with Ken early on when he launched a new institute and was his right-hand person and his top student. And in some ways, is still considered the top expert in his theory. The third moment of clarity was when a friend called me up and said, hey, Vipassana, which is my wife's name, I knew her because I met her at Ken Wilber's house doing a graduate student meeting. I thought she was beautiful, but I thought, she was way above my, punching weight, if you will. And he called me and he said, they were friends also. He said, Vipassana is interested in you romantically. And in that moment, all of a sudden I had this moment of clarity where I knew we were getting married. And it was a very strange experience. And so as soon as I hung up from him, I called her on the phone. And I'm really nervous around women. I'm not a ladies' man. I call her up and I'm like, Vipassana, this is Sean. I'm deeply attracted to you and I would love to ask you out on a date. Let me know if you're available. I had never, ever done anything like that before. So it was like the moment of clarity gave me, it wasn't even the confidence. It was more of like just the obvious next step in an unfolding process. And the fact that I met her at Ken's, it's all connected. Ken and I go back many lifetimes. I've had many moments of realizing that he and I have been in a deep dance, at him usually as teacher and me as student. But those have all been planetary. But so I think the main thing that Wilber's work awoken in me was he has a model of egocentric to sociocentric to world-centric, and then what I call planet-centric. And he has a notion of cosmic-centric. It awoken in me the sense that our consciousness is evolving, and there's things we can do to support that process in ourselves and others. And I realized there was something missing in his model after, many years after working with him, and it's galactic-centric. And that it was like the gap in his model, all of a sudden I realized we need to become one with the galaxy, with the many galaxies, with the multiverse. Because Ken kind of jumps from world-centric, embracing everyone on the planet and all sentient beings, nature, to cosmocentric, which is basically like a non-dual mode of consciousness. So there was this piece of galactic-centric all of a sudden started becoming very important to me. With Elon Musk going to Mars, with SpaceX and other things happening, when I started seeing the exoplanets being, in a few years ago, we thought there were 750. And then in one announcement from NASA, they announced 750 new exoplanets that had been verified. So in one day it doubled. And now we're at almost 4,300. And so there's just this galactic like intensity of like, I have to help people awaken not just to the planet and to nature, and not just our fellow human beings, but there's a vast world, multiverse out there, and I need to help people connect with that. And Wilbur's work gives me a very strong foundation to do that, even though in many ways I've moved on from that being my primary kind of theoretical foundation.
Yeah, what I hear as you're talking, Sean, is certainly my story, and perhaps the story of those of you listening to this recorded, is that our life has stepping stones. Our life has, so okay, I'm born and I go to school, but I know I'm different, but I don't know what to do with that. Or maybe even like me, I was, probably relatively speaking, I was approximately your age, Sean, when I opened to all of this kind of thing. But nonetheless, we come upon people in our lives that serve as teachers, mentors, whatever you want to call it, or people even that we just have relationships with. But we're not to, what I hear you saying, Sean, is we're not necessarily to stay there.
Right.
We're to use that as the springboard into why we're here and why we're in body and what we came to teach and do. And I think it's one of the things that when I met you, Sean, your life agreement is different than my life agreement, but where it overlaps is to help people understand, as you call it, the multiverse. But for me, it's like, why are you here? And I'm not going to label anybody in this group, but I will tell you that recently I guided a past life regression, and regressions go where they're meant to go, and far be it from me to ever think I know where it's going. And that regression went straight to the home base of that client. And it was like, when we come to Earth, and often if we're IP, then we're sort of like floundering. We're just sort of like, oh, where do I belong? And where's my solidity? And then at times it's latching onto, here's my solidity. Here's who I really am. Here's where I really come from. And yet I'm here on Earth with purpose. And that's what I hear you talking about, Sean.
A couple other pieces that I think are relevant. One is I started teaching what I called the Embodied Practitioner Program, which was like a year-long leadership program where we did somatic work and group work as well as heavy intellectual work. I've always had a super big, strong mind, but I've always felt the importance of complementing the mental activity with opening the heart and dropping down into the belly and activating the body. And so this Embodied Practitioner Program was a chance for me to do all that, because usually programs will do one or the other, or maybe two, but not all three. And in that context, I realized that through Wilbur's work, I had primarily been engaged with what I now call the story of self. And this is basically the story of the personality. I was developing my consciousness, my personality. I was becoming a more integrated person, all these things that are important in his theory and system. What I realized was more important to me, particularly because I was going into the fairy work and working with Faye, was that what's missing in Wilbur's work is the story of the soul. And he kind of just jumps over that. And so it's fascinating Wilbur has given me both the most important tools that I've had my whole life to do my galactic work, as well as allowing me to see major gaps that are missing. So it's this very interesting dynamic where it's kind of, he's given me a lot, and then the things he hasn't given me, he's given me because I've realized that there was something else that was needed. And so when I started focusing on the soul, I read all of Michael Newton's work, and this just blew me away. because this wasn't the material that Kin included very much. So this started giving me a map of the soul and the soul's development. And I started becoming very interested in my soul maturation. And all of a sudden, and this was about 15 years ago, the question that became most important to me was not, am I integrated and developing this incarnation, but how am I setting myself up now for my subsequent incarnations, right? So I started thinking of development in a much different frame. And the thing that drew me the most in Newton's work, and I noticed this in Robert Monroe's work, when I read all of his work, the things that I marked were always the stories by him or by Newton of people having interplanetary experiences. So I was most fascinated by reading accounts when Robert Monroe would find himself on another planet, or he would encounter some little, furry creature on another planet, or a Newton regression would talk about another experience on another planet. There weren't many of them, but there were enough where I was like, whoa, like, what's going on? Like, seriously? Like, people are like, huh? And then you had one book that had come out, and there was one chapter in that book, I think it was Evolving Your Soul, that talked about interplanetary souls. And I remember basically reading that whole chapter in the bookstore before buying it, because I wanted to know the information so bad. I just sat there and read it for like 35 minutes, and knowing I was going to buy the book, but like, it was like I had to read this chapter. And then later when I learned you were going to do a whole book on it, I was like over the moon. So this was another early indication. When I started coming across descriptions of other, what I would consider interplanetary souls, I had this major resonance, and I had this curiosity, and it's like I couldn't have enough of those descriptions to help me understand what's possible as a human being to have those other kinds of encounters and realities.
Yeah, there's a zillion kind of avenues we could go down. I'll just say that Michael Newton, in many ways, served the purpose for me in a way that, Sean, you've described that Ken Wilber served for you, is that it was a foundational piece. And I spent many years working alongside Michael Newton and co-teaching with him, and that it was time for me to catapult onward into my own work. Okay, so because I just feel like there's some really rich content that I want people to hear about, Sean, and I'll just say, and you might want to comment where it's found, but one of the ways, Sean, I created questions to chat with you about today is I dug into that amazing article that you sent to me that you wrote. So, okay, so Sean, talk about, if you will, as you began to realize, or when you realized you were an interplanetary soul. If we walked into the local grocery store, it'd be like, what the heck are you guys talking about? Right. But I think this group is ready for some really juicy, unique content. As you started learning about your IP nature, Sean, I guess I'm just going to put it this way. Where do you come from? What's unique about your soul? What, if I could put it this way, what kind of IP soul are you? What's the nature of your IP-ness, if you will?
Yeah. All right. So I mentioned that as I started doing more experiential practices, working with nature intelligences, and fairy beings, and part of what started happening in that space is kind of like the deeper I went into the inner earth, I was like popping out on the other side and having galactic experiences. And this was very confusing to me. And I did a past life regression with a Newton trained person. Stuff came up in there. I was working with a particular fairy being, female, who's often experienced or perceived as being as tall as a human. And so doing a lot of work with her. But I kept having kind of this mixture of like fairy encounters, fae encounters, and galactic experiences.
And Sean, if you will, sorry to interrupt you, define for people, because I have a feeling they're wondering. So in your words, what is a fairy being or a fae being, and what do you mean by galactic experience?
Yeah, so there's a vast literature on people who have experienced these beings, and they're more or less in agreement, but essentially it's autonomous beings that are on a different evolutionary path, that are very connected to the natural world and often play a role with helping natural processes to occur and repairing things. So the four common elementals are what are generally thought of as undines or mermaids, sylphs or winged fairy beings, salamanders, which are like a fire being, and then gnomes, which are an earth being. So these go back to alchemical processes. But in addition to those, every local area has its own fairies and nature spirits and they're kind of local fauna. But then there's other types of beings that occur more globally across the planet. So there's a whole rich biodiversity of these types of beings. And because of my deep connection to nature, I was drawn to working with the subtle intelligences that are part of the invisible landscape of the natural world. Galactic experiences, at that point, it was more of just an intuition. It was more of like just feeling the stars, feeling the vastness, feeling a connection. I was like trying to go into the nature and earth, but was like kept going out big and was confused. So, and then it was showing up when I was doing like regression work, things were popping up. And then I came across a book called Meet the Hybrids, which is about physical human beings who identify as interplanetary souls and usually having genetic material from 3 to 10 different star races. And so in reading that book, there were 3 people in the book. It was like 8 interviews. 3 of them talked about their ability to experience the Fae and the Galactics and Celestials. And this was really big for me because up to this point, I didn't have a good framework to hold all of this because I don't feel a very strong connection to the celestial realm or the angelic realm. Like that just hasn't showed up in my soul stream process. But I feel very connected to the Fae and very connected to the Galactic. And the Galactic are essentially the star beings that live on or connected to planets or have some kind of interdimensional kind of quality to them. Sometimes Galactics are confused with Celestials and sometimes Fae are confused with Galactics. Like these are categories that are not fixed. And in this process, what I realized is I reached out to 2 of the women and had sessions with them. And both of them identified a number of star races that I'm connected to. And there was a lot of overlap between both of them. And another person who I spoke with identified some other star races I'm connected to. Arcturian, Pleiadian, Tau Chi, like there's several places. And what I got from that process was that each of them, because each had different clairvoyant capacities, and each have their own star seed makeup, that different ones would resonate with different layers of my own being. So on the one hand, it would look like, they weren't all agreeing because they were also identifying additional races I was connected to. So there wasn't complete agreement, but there was like 4 or 5 races they all did agree on. And it made me realize that I'm connected to about 10 different races through different incarnations over the years, lots of years, but that there's a core group of, that I've been connected to more so. My interplanetary soul seems to be a galactic fairy, if you will. Seems to be a fae-based kind of elven, think of Tolkien, think of J.R.R. Tolkien, and on one of the things I learned from Vanessa Lamort and from Jacqueline Smith, both who were interviewed in this book, that there are Sirian elves on the planet. There's a couple planets in the Sirian star system. And there are elven beings that look very much like J.R. Tolkien's rendition of the elves. Human-sized, very noble, very aesthetic. In some ways look like Nordics, in terms of the ET races. And so essentially my core connection is basically these elven beings connected to Syria, right? So no wonder I was confused of going into the fairy realm and discovering the galactic realm, because it actually comes together in me, right? Where I'm both in a sense, fae and galactic. And so one of my core purposes is to help be an ambassador and to bridge those realms, but also to create frameworks that include the celestials and the angelic realm, so that other people can kind of do a better job of coming to terms with their own kind of crazy mixed up, combination of things.
So Sean, what's your sense about how often these, given what you've said about where you come from and sort of the threads or the streams of your soul experience and your soul origin, in your opinion, how often do you think such souls, and I know this is kind of maybe hard to put this into words, how often do souls that come from these various origins or streams, whatever we want to call them, how often do they come into body on Earth, into the human incarnation, such as yourself?
The sense I have is that there's not many of my tribe, if you will, here, but that there are a lot of other similar kinds of souls with similar kinds of experiences that are here. And there's a lot of us. I teach a year-long program, and in that program, like yours, part of it's that I draw these people to me because, I'm one of the few people out there saying, hey, let's talk about this. Let's explore this. Let's try and make sense of this together. And so I might have a distorted perception around this because it's like everywhere I look, I'm seeing these people, right? Fae, galactic, celestial, it feels like we're in a big transition, and there's multiple timelines that are getting created, and it's very complex and interesting. And so my sense is there's an influx. My own process is that it feels like I've been coming to this earth for a long time. I feel very comfortable as a human. It seems like a lot of IP souls are kind of like trying to kind of get what's going on? Mm-hmm. I feel very human. Like at a core level, I don't feel like I am human, but I feel very comfortable in my human shoes, if you will. And it feels like I've been coming a long, long time. But I came many, many times as basically an elf, an elven being. And I, at a certain point, I made a decision, there's all these different incarnations the earth has gone through. And in some of the prior ones, the elven worlds were much more part of earth than they are now. And you can think of Lemuria or Atlantis as kind of one reference point for that. It seems that at a certain point, I decided to stop incarnating as an elven being and start incarnating as a human being because of my deep love of humanity. Because I wanted to serve human beings in a deeper, more profound way. And in a sense, I kind of gave up my immortality as an elven being. They're very long-lived to start cycling through these 60 to 70 year lives, that humans have. Most elven beings and galactic beings live hundreds of years, right? Thousands of years in some cases. And in fact, in my regression session with Linda, one of the very bizarre experiences I had was basically, it was the first experience of when I first kind of was asked to look at my feet and the first being that I experienced myself as was as a mantis being on a ship. And what was interesting about that mantis being was I think Linda had asked me a question like, is this a past life? Is this, where are you time-wise? And immediately I realized this is both a past life, a present life, and a future life. Because the mantis being that I am as that has been around for thousands of years and is going to be around for thousands of more years. So compared to Sean as an incarnated, earth being, it's a past life, it's a parallel present life, and that me as that being, or to however we want to try and describe that relationship, is going to be a future soul stream of mine after I die. So it was a very bizarre experience to be in contact with a parallel life that's so long lived compared to this particular amount of soul energy that's incarnated as Sean. And this was the other thing that really helped me with Newton's work, was realizing that the soul can incarnate multiple times, giving 20%, 30%, 15%, right? And that kind of framework helped me realize kind of what's going on with me. because I feel like I have several parallel lives, and I've had several experiences of what I call trilocation, where I'm literally like in 3 different incarnations at the same time. And those have been very confusing, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, I've written down about 4 things I either want to say or ask you about, Sean. I mean, this is where I realize, and I think it's part of my soul agreement in body is, and of course, as best I know, I'm an earth-based soul. I've had a few incarnations that are non-earth. And of course, long ago, I came from somewhere else before I came to earth. I also know my soul, my higher self, has a responsibility to what I've been just told to call the Interplanetary Council, which is a council in the higher realm of representatives from various celestial locations. That said, as you all are listening to Sean describe in human language, which is really what we have in order to talk about these kinds of things, it's incredibly complex. It's, and I try my darndest to boil it down enough to put it into something understandable, but I'm sure that all of you, as you're listening to Sean, are absorbing complexity isn't even a sufficient word to explain these origins and locations, and call them soul threads or whatever. And I'll just comment, partly for all of you, but partly for you, Sean. I have a female client that I've worked with periodically, and she's fairly sure, and I think she's right, that she is a mantis being. She is a mantis soul. And physiologically, she looks like a mantis, literally looks like a mantis. It would be hard to argue, not that I argue with her about it, but be hard to argue with her about it. And when she gets download and she's like triggered energetically, her jaw literally has it's almost like her jaw muscles, loosen or disconnect. And she literally has what we would see in the jaw of a literal mantis. So, okay.
Let me just add one thing, since you mentioned download. This was another of my kind of galactic experiences. I've worked with the Enneagram system for a long time. I love it. It's been very helpful for me as a coach, as a husband. I think it saved our marriage several times, realizing like kind of my type versus my wife's type and all this. I always had a feeling, looking at the Enneagram, that there were certain patterns I could intuit, but I wasn't yet figuring out. And I have a very strong, when I was like 2-3 years old, my mom would give me puzzles, and I could just pick a piece and put it in the right spot. And I still have this ability. It's very weird. It's like this unconscious spatial capacity where I analyze the shape of the puzzle, and I can just put it in the spot more or less, like very quickly. And it's like it bypasses my thinking mind. It's just this very fast at puzzles like that. So I have this pattern recognition kind of superpower. And I could tell that there was something about the Enneagram early on that intrigued me, but I just wasn't sure what it was. Then like 10 years later, I got this download, and it really was just this, And I became obsessed, like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, what's his name with the mashed potatoes, right? I was staying up. I realized what the pattern was. Like the download was all of a sudden, and before it was like there was an intuition that I was going to get this download. That's part of why I mentioned that piece. It was almost like I had this sense that something was coming, but it was like 10 years later. Then I get the download and I realize the pattern. I start mapping the pattern out. And then I cut out all these triangles with numbers on the ends. And I realize that they build something. So I start taping them together to figure out what does it build. And it basically, I realized that I was creating a 3D version of the Enneagram, and it's built out of octahedrons. I didn't know anything about the Platonic solids or sacred geometry. Always interested in it, knew nothing. I was staying up to like 1, 2 o'clock at night building this thing. And it was just like, it's like I had to get it out of my head. It was like bizarre. Finally, I got to a point where 2 different groups of models I was making came together and created the model. Everyone was asleep, and they were all like, "Dad's doing that weird thing again with the geo models." And so I was totally dark out, totally silent. I'm looking at the kitchen counter where I've put this thing, and I just relaxed. It was like I finally could see external what I was intuiting internally, and I realized that was it. I had finally created it. So then I started studying this thing, and it turns out it's a sonic device, and that it involved Metatron. So that's one angelic connection I have. I have a lot of connections with Metatron, partly because of my meta-integration mind, bringing a lot of different things together. I'm a designer, in a sense. And the Arcturians, and so this was a strong connection with the Arcturians and their sound technologies. So this was another whole galactic experience of basically creating, it's essentially a 0-point energy device in terms of geometry. I mean, I know nothing about technology, but I can tell that it's basically, it's a model of 0-point energy. If that'll ever go anywhere, I don't know, but it's about the Enneagram. And so I'm working on a book describing all of this.
Okay, so I have a couple of different questions, Sean, and this is the beauty of each of us. It's like you all are really learning a lot about Sean, the uniqueness of his soul, the vastness of his knowledge, and all of this. So, and I know one of my soul agreements is to try to ground, not that this information is not grounded, it's amazingly grounded. So Sean, question. I know, as you've already talked about, you have a wife and 2 lovely daughters. You have a lovely wife and 2 lovely daughters. How do you work together given who you are?
So my best guess would be that my wife is a wise earth soul like you. She's been very open-minded, very kind of tolerant. I mean, at first it was like, oh my gosh, my husband's into fairies. And then it was like, oh my gosh, my husband's into aliens. Oh my gosh, my husband is an alien fairy, right? So it's yeah. A lot for anyone, including myself. So I think she's grounded me kind of more on the earth plane, and I've expanded her more into the Fae and the galactic. And they know that I'm really into UFOs and extraterrestrials. And they know that I'm really into fairies and nature spirits. And so I've just tried to support them to have an open mind around the multiverse and the complexity of life, and for them to really find their own way. I'm very open to them rejecting anything that I'm saying. Like, I don't need them to believe it. I'm fine if they dislike, I really want them just to have as much room to be in whatever relationship they want to this information. But I think it's a good balance. I think we find, a nice way to do that with them. In the early years, they're all into fairies, right? Like, that's like way cool. But then as they grew out of that and their friends grew out of that, So it was cool when I was into fairies when they were really little, but then when I continued to be into fairies as they got older, then that was confusing. So there have been some soul moments with them where we've all had to kind of navigate this together.
Yeah, when you're talking, Sean, I'll just say, I mean, obviously, these are, of course, the agreements that we've made. Okay, so a couple more questions, but I have this kind of just burning question. And if you don't have an answer to this, Sean, that's totally fine. You may or may not know Earl and me well enough to know we are very focused on current events. Earl is a Ph.D. political scientist, blah, 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 blah. If I was surprised this question came into my mind, but answer it if you choose. If you had the ear of Joe Biden, and if Joe Biden said to you, Sean, given your knowledge base, what advice would you give me about trying to move the United States forward and move us through these challenging times? Would you have an answer? Would you have advice for Joe Biden?
I would.
And maybe Sean, because I was going to ask you this anyway, tell people how they can find your work and find you. And that way I won't need to ask that at the end. Yeah.
Okay. So my kind of mainstream job, if you will, is as a business consultant and coach in leadership development. And that work can be found at metaintegral.net or com. So meta, then integral. And that's where I mostly focus on 10 different types of capital that can be used to evaluate social impact. So that's my day job. You can also go to whatsupwithufos.com. That's a website I launched with my colleague, Tom Curran. This is our effort to make the topic of UFOs more accessible to the average curious adult who wants good information. We curated 150 articles and videos and put them together on that website in categories. And Linda was in a course with me where I walked through that over 6 weeks. And then for the really, rabbit hole stuff, go to exostudies.org. And that's where I do my Exo Studies work, which is basically a big container for UFOs and all anomalous experiences. Exo basically means any reality beyond our normal reality. Exo means outside. So outside our reference point is kind of how I use it. I tend to focus on UFOs and galactic themes, but I include everything. And there's a year-long program, 42 topics. They're listed on that website and a lot of resources. I do not work with Greg Brandon, but I'm aware of his work and I like him. All right, Joe Biden. So a lot could be said. If I had more time, I would think of additional things to advise him on. But the first thing would just be around UFO disclosure. And, because I feel this is a big galactic catalyst. I don't know if any of you are really following what's happening, but major things have happened in the last 2 years around this. In the New York Times, on page 17, so it was buried, but nevertheless, they ran a story, Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, two very reputable journalists in this space, ran a story quoting 3 very credible people, Harry Reid, the Senate Minority Leader, former, Eric Davis, a contractor working with the Pentagon's UFO program, and someone else I'm forgetting right now. All 3 of them testified to the fact that the US government has, quote, off-world vehicles not made on this earth. In other words, end quote. In other words, UFO crash retrievals. So the New York Times has run a story pointing that out. I mean, everyone in the UFO community knows that to be the case, more or less. But the fact that the New York Times published that the Pentagon announced a UFO task force. Marco Rubio's involved with that. There's a lot of other things that are happening. I think this is a very important development that can allow us as a Earth civilization to start to really wake up to our galactic situation, and the fact that we're not alone and that there's a lot going on out there, and that a lot of people have known about that for a long time, but for a lot of understandable and very frustrating reasons, there's been a lot of secrecy around the topic. So I would advise Joe to work with me around how could we move that needle forward, because I think the implications are earth changing. Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, Sean. And I'll just say this, and at some point you and I, or you, Earl, and I can have some chats about such things. Earl has been talking about wanting to get more involved. I personally believe that Joe Biden is open to that kind of conversation. And I just feel like the sole agreements that so many of us have agreed to really play into this. Well, we could go on for a whole nother hour, but you all now know who is Sean. You know how to access his work, how to tap in with him if you want to learn more. If you forget and you can't find the contact information for Sean, just reach out to me, everybody, and I'm happy to give it to you. Sean, it's just been an awesome pleasure to have you with us. I'm always, what do I want to say? When I say triggered, I mean triggered in a really good way, that there's so much important progress that we need to be making on the planet, and making with the perspective of understanding this broad impact that is affecting the universe and our planet vis-a-vis souls. That's our purpose, and that's our role. So everybody, let's together thank Sean so much. And Sean, be well. Please tell your lovely wife hi. Just gratitude for you taking the time to be here with us.
Great. Thanks, Linda. Great to be here. And yeah, just lots of love. And you're in good hands with Linda. She's amazing, as you well know. So blessings. Much love to all of you.
Thank you, Sean. Take good care. Bye.